matter expert on cutting-edge topics that are of interest to woodland owners. James Steenberg is a senior research and planning forester with the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, where he's responsible for the department's research on silviculture, climate change, and forest carbon. Huge topics, very important topics. He has a PhD in environmental science and is an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University's School for Resource and Environmental Studies, where he teaches and recently completed a Killam postdoctoral fellowship. He was also a Fulbright Scholar at the United States Forest Service. James has 15 years of forestry research experience as a governmental scientist, a consultant, and academic researcher focusing on forests. The title of James' presentation today is Managing Woodlands in a Changing Climate. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much, and really happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to present again. And a lot of hands went up when I saw that people had been to these Woodland Conferences in the past, and I was asked about this year's round of Woodland Conferences and doing something on climate change. And the day before the first one, which was the other week in Weymouth, I thought I'd better put a talk together. But I also knew that it's got to be something fresh. What else? What can we talk about with climate change and carbon and woodlands that wouldn't be something that you've heard already? Well, it just so happens that we've got the perfect thing to talk about, hot off the press, out front, which is a new learning module for woodland owners. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about it today. Oh, I'm looking at my... Sorry. I'm not the IT person. So I'm going to frame my talk around this module that we put together, which is available in print at the front. Coming from Simon Rubazi, who many of you will know. And this was, I think, a pretty good and innovative way to go about getting information out there on climate change for woodland owners. It involved partnering with external organizations, so Dalhousie University and NTRI, and through this partnership we were able to leverage funding from MyTax and hire a grad student. And grad student Cole Vale, who's not here today, unfortunately, led the writing of this, along with Peter Dunker, who's over here, Jane Barker from NTRI, and myself. So I'd like to talk about this today. So I'm going to frame my presentation around the structure of the module, like I said. And the first thing that we do is dip our toe in the climate change subject area. A lot of you will be familiar with it, could be new territory for others, but touching on some of the core concepts of, what's a greenhouse gas, what's weather, what's climate, what is weather versus climate, and of course, what does that mean about climate change? And I think that's a good starting point for this subject matter, weather versus climate. It's a gorgeous sunny day out there and pretty warm, probably above seasonal today. The last Woodland Conference, it was cold and snowy, so it was easy to say, well, it's cold and snowy, where's this global warming I've heard so about? But it feels like it's out here today. But the thing that we want to start the lesson on and kind of set the stage with is this understanding of climate change from kind of two different perspectives, which is the long-term changes in average conditions, warmer temperatures, more rain in Nova Scotia, but also the anomalies, the anomalous events, the more frequent outliers that you wouldn't really expect in Nova Scotia, but that are happening more often. Those are the ones that you usually feel on the ground. Those are the ones that the ecosystems are experiencing. The ones that we see in the news. I often have news headlines or maps about anomalous weather. And I found this one when I was preparing the talk, which apparently this winter was the darkest winter, least amount of sunshine, since like 1974. And I don't think that's a climate change impact. I really hope it wasn't. That was a long winter. But one thing that we know about this winter, yet again, how often are we saying this now? The something-somethingist on record, right? So this is one of the warmest winters on record. People who are working in the forest sector and with their woodlands might have known that this was a tough winter, for forest roads or for operating conditions. Never really did get too cold. But also droughts. And I was thinking, again, preparing this talk around climate change impacts that I had just experienced recently. So last summer, we had a really bad heat spell. And I went out to one of our research trial sites with my research assistant here. It was a really, really hot day, walking around the woodlands there in a wetland, which was probably about a hectare in size. pushing down. I couldn't find any water at all. It was bone dry. My dog was thirsty. We had to have a short day. But that same week, in this heat drought, talking to contractors, talking to the truck driver who was worried about, his business because the wood coming out of this operation was so light from this heat that he thought he would lose a lot of money. So climate change impacts really experienced all throughout the supply chain of forestry, all across ecosystem types in Nova Scotia, in different ways, and the one key theme always being with lots of uncertainty and unpredictability. Dave Sutherland talked a lot about that unpredictability piece being so important. So the following two sections of the learning module will talk about what can we expect in Nova Scotia in terms of the changing climate, and not just, there's what conditions might we expect in general, but also getting into the data of here's what we actually predict under different global models for modeling the climate, and what that means when you scale it down to Nova Scotia. And of course, what does that mean for our trees, our ecosystems, and the people who own woodlands, the people who work in the forest, or the people who have really strong values around the forest, like almost everyone does. Well, we know that Nova Scotia is going to be wet. But this does come back to the weather versus climate and, average conditions versus anomalies, right? So you picture, like a bell curve, like a distribution where here's the average right in the middle of that curve. Well, we know it's going this way. It's going to get warmer and wetter. But the freak events on the tail ends of these curves are the ones that make us worry. So we know it's going to be wetter in Nova Scotia, but that precipitation is going to be falling in bigger events. Wetter storms, a lot more rain, a lot more winter storms with rain as opposed to snow. And in fact, drier summers, despite the mean average increases in rainfall by the year 2100. And so this map here, again, the anomaly, this shows the anomaly, which is what's the difference between what you're telling me is going to happen in 2100 in the summertime versus what the climate has been in the past 30 years in Nova Scotia. These aren't huge numbers, but it's going to be drier, especially in certain parts of the province in terms of lowered rainfall. And that's important because even if the rainfall is the exact same, if it's 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees warmer, trees need a lot more water. That ecosystem needs more water to sustain itself under the same conditions. So we got wetter sometimes, and we certainly have warmer pretty much all the time. So we can expect increases in temperature across the board in Nova Scotia and across all seasons, as you can see here. These images are all from the module as well. So I tried to include all the graphics from this learning module in this talk. And you can see, depending on what's called a climate change scenario. So the global organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, they produce data, they produce reports, and they do a lot of scientific research across the world. But it's hard to predict climate change because we don't know what we're going to do in terms of reducing our emissions, how are we going to make our forests better carbon sinks, and all these things. So we look at different scenarios of maybe we did okay and reduced our emissions here, that middle scenario. Maybe we didn't listen at all and kept on putting carbon out of the stacks all the time, and maybe even at higher rates. And you can see that can translate to the difference between 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, like we're trying to target, all the way to 5-6 degrees of warming on average in Nova Scotia. So it will definitely be a warmer province. And those direct effects of climate change in terms of the weather that we're experiencing and just more energy in the atmosphere from these increases in temperature means more disturbances. So what we can expect, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to this, is more frequent and more severe natural disturbances in Nova Scotia. The word natural becomes a bit more tenuous, doesn't it, when we're talking about becoming so much more frequent and severe. So we certainly can profile here the dominant disturbance regimes that we have in this province. Wind being a big one, as you know. Insects, namely spruce budworm, but others, and fire. So windstorms, hurricanes, fire, all these warming conditions will make them more frequent. And warming conditions like warming winter temperatures, well, that favors a lot of our invasive forest pests as well. where the cold freeze in the winter kind of knocks them off, like the hemlock woolly anemone, for example. And like I said, most importantly at all, especially when you think about how am I going to adapt to these crazy conditions, is your adaptation better include the chances for surprise and unpredictability. So I won't go through, because I've done this before, and just profile all our different disturbances and how they're changing, but let's talk about one that's probably fresh on our minds. And we just got a whole presentation on it, and don't yell it out if you don't know the answer. It's Hurricane Fiona, post-tropical storm Fiona, really a generational storm, and seeing such huge impacts across a swath of the provinces is unbelievable. For me, it kind of bookends my time in Nova Scotia. I moved here in September 2003. Does anyone remember what happened then? Hurricane 1, and here I am again with another one, and always doing research on them, to me, is important. One of the things from the point of view of the department and doing research and improving the science-based tools that we try and make available to people is understanding what this means for, in a changing climate where we're going to see more of this, no matter what we do. To some degree, there's going to be more. Well, how will that influence how we can manage our forests, and what kind of recommendations would we want to give to people who are looking for different tools, around ecological forestry, for example? And that brings us to a challenge that I think Fiona kind of really puts a bold-faced letter all around, which is the vulnerability to wind throw of recently treated stands. So as Dave was mentioning, a lot of the woods that blew down were recently treated with some kind of partial harvest, like a commercial thinning or a shelter wood, or the new kid in town in our silvicultural guide for the ecological matrix, which is an irregular shelter wood. These are very vulnerable right after they're treated. So what we're driving at with ecological forestry and with the silvicultural guide and the underpinning philosophy here is that we're building more resilient forest ecosystems, mixed wood forests, that are more wind firm with multiple age cohorts that build resilience to these kinds of disturbances in the long term. But in the short term, they're vulnerable to wind throw. So what can we do here? We need to integrate climate change into our planning, understanding that in a changing climate, probably blowdown is going to be part of their reality, and maybe link it into your management objectives, where retaining some blowdown it has really big biodiversity benefits, as was alluded to earlier, but also being prepared for it, and also in the way that we manage in terms of recommended silvicultural treatments for different forests. Well, we're going to do some more research there as well on different indicators of vulnerability to wind throw to still try and reduce that vulnerability and maintain our ecological forestry objectives. Because I think that's going to be really important, where we can say with uncertain certainty that we're going to have more episodes like Fiona in the future. And a critical piece here in bringing it back to ecological forestry, one of the cornerstones of ecological forestry and the Leahy review that was brought up earlier is trying to emulate our natural disturbances in forest management as a sort of broader coarse filter or landscape way to protect biodiversity. So the department has put in a lot of research and collaborative approaches to building our understanding of Nova Scotia's disturbance regimes so that we can better understand them for ourselves, for knowledge, to inform our woodland management, but so that we can also try and emulate them in forest management. So these two studies that were done in response to the Leahy review with department researchers as well as researchers from the University of New Brunswick, they're all available online. And I highlight a few recent studies throughout this talk that are available, and if you want them, they're online, or just shoot me an email. I'll put my email at the end of the talk as well, and I can send them over. So these ones profile our disturbances, but also how to work with them in an ecological forestry context. And the key thing that wasn't really touched on in these yet, but will be, is that, well, we want to emulate our natural disturbances, but they're changing with climate change. They're becoming more frequent, right, and more severe. So that doesn't mean you get to cut a whole lot more wood, and it's part of ecological forestry. What it does mean is that we're going to have to adapt to that as well in meeting our objectives for ecological forestry. We've got some ongoing research on that that's still trying to touch on this topic, more of a modeling-based kind of research because it involves, looking out to the year 2100 with the University of New Brunswick. So stand by for that. But these natural disturbances are definitely going to be where we first start to experience a lot of climate change. Whether it's a disturbance event, like I just talked about, or really warm winters, or a drought in the summer, or something similar. So when it comes to responding to climate change in managing woodlands, there's kind of two sides of the same coin in how we can go about this, and both are 100% needed. The one side, which is kind of the bummer side, which I've been talking about so far, is climate change impacts and adapting to impacts and understanding vulnerability. The other side of that coin, which I'll talk about in a minute, is the ability for woodlands and forests and forest management to fight climate change, because forests store a lot of carbon and can be sinks of atmospheric carbon, pull carbon out of the atmosphere, keep it out of there for a long time, which helps reduce the overall effects of climate change. But on the adaptation and the vulnerability side, we touch on that and we try and provide a few tools, and we profile the different silvicultural treatments available and what they can do for adapting woodlands to climate change, and some key areas of understanding. So one key area is, we're in Nova Scotia. It's a windy province, but it's also a diverse province when it comes to our trees. The Canadian forest has a mix of cold climate, sort of boreal species, as well as warmer climate species, and they have very different vulnerabilities to the climate changing over the long term. So we kind of profile some of those different levels in just a coarse way of vulnerability based on best available research that's out there, and this can help inform your long-term planning of what you might favor in your management, alongside other important ecological objectives, like another key piece of the ecological forestry being maintaining and restoring, enhancing our long-lived, intermediate to shade tolerant tree species. And you can see that the ones that we have here that are our lit species, some of them are more vulnerable to climate change, but they all tend to be more intermediate. Or some of the most vulnerable boreal species, like balsam fir, depending on your woodlands and what your operations might be. A lot of people won't lose a lot of sleep or shed a lot of tears over balsam fir becoming less prominent in the warming climate. But certainly there's two pieces on that adaptation that the woodland owner might want to think about, which is adapting your ecosystems and the vulnerability of the kind of forest types that you have on your woodland. Do you have a bunch of balsam fir here, a bunch of black spruce over here that tend to be more vulnerable to the warming climate, that tend to be more vulnerable to more frequent windstorms as well, and that might direct how you want to manage for a climate change adaptation point of view? Or do you have a mix of tolerant hardwoods that tend to be, or some other warmer climate species like white pine that might be more suited for future climates? And how can you build tools into your management of your woodlands to help you with that? And one of those tools that I kind of want to put a spotlight on in this talk is the pre-commercial thinning. Dave mentioned it as well there, and I think it's a powerful silvicultural tool in the stand-tending sense for not just fiber objectives and increasing growth and yield, because certainly that's part of it, but other newer objectives around woodland management for climate change. And you know what? PCT checks a lot of boxes for climate change, for forests on the economic side, as well as for carbon as well. So that's why it's in the spotlight here. We know that we can go in and select, maybe historically softwood crop species that for the sake of increasing fiber production. But you can also, that's a perfect time for stand intervention to be targeting more climate resilient and adapted species in the future. Increasing yields and also increasing carbon yields as well is an important piece from PCT. We know from research trials we have going back to the 70s, the real the gains in growth and in carbon sequestration and storage that can occur, as well as some reduced wind throw vulnerability with a thin stand and less demands for moisture from the soils in a thin stand for a bit after treatment in a warmer, potentially drier summer. Nothing is impervious to windstorms, as you saw earlier, but this is certainly one tool that kind of touches on both sides of that climate change coin, the mitigation and the adaptation. This is where I'll end on for today. It's the less of a depressing story of climate change and forests in Nova Scotia, which is the carbon file. So that's our final chapter in the module, and so there's a lot of interest there, but boy, is there a lot of complexities there as well. So we try and introduce some of those subject areas as well. I swear I won't describe this figure. It's in the module. There's a lot going on. I just put it in there to show you how fancy this learning module is. But also that this information that we're building on here does come from peer-reviewed research on forest carbon that the department's doing, such as this study by a UNB grad student and myself and another prof at UNB, among others, that is another open source paper that I'm happy to share with anyone, just to constantly be updating our knowledge on forest carbon and how we can do the best that we can do with our woodlands. It talks about forest carbon in the context of the triad. The triad being such an important thing in forest management in Nova Scotia today, so much so that the minister really started with it, right, and described it. So it gives a little bit of information on the carbon dynamics of the different zones of the triad, and how all of them, done appropriately and with informed management objectives and planning, can do good for carbon in different ways. There's always trade-offs like there is with other values, economics, carbon, recreation, biodiversity. There's always trade-offs between them, but each zone of the triad can do some good towards fighting climate change. Whether it's having a bank account that's well stocked with carbon money and keeping that money in the bank, like the conservation zone. So that might be the case of trying to reduce vulnerability to natural disturbances, even though you're not managing for fiber, to keep that carbon in the forest. Or what we tend to look at more from the department point of view in the managed forest is the carbon dynamics of the ecological matrix and high production zone. We've done a lot of modeling, and there's information out there now. And, both of these zones can have good for carbon from the point of view of an individual stand, and what we call a yield curve. In this case, a carbon yield curve. We know that high production forestry can be a carbon sink, and in fact is a little bit more of a carbon sink than this example of an irregular shelter wood. But these things play out at the landscape level, and they're informed by our management history and the current forest conditions, whereas the ecological matrix tends to keep more carbon on the landscape, and that's important from the carbon sink point of view as well. So these things matter, scale matters, and how this plays out over time, but both these zones of the triad and all the modeling that we've done have contributed to net removals of carbon from the atmosphere in the long term in Nova Scotia. And I think that's an important takeaway. And then those are the more complex carbon dynamics, and you really got to get into the weeds to tease them apart. But there's some clear, easy wins for carbon in woodlands in Nova Scotia too, on the extremes of these sides, which is reforesting. Whether that's restoring, something that might be need a fill plant, ecosystem restoration, or whether it's an agricultural field that wants to be reforested. Afforestation, no matter how you shape the numbers and what side of the fence you're on, is always a win for carbon. Same as avoiding deforestation and land use change. So those are some other easy wins that we talk about in the module for fighting climate change with forests and forest management as well. There's also, and what I know there's a lot of interest on, is new economic opportunities for managing forests for carbon. Probably the most prominent one is carbon credits, but as people might know in the room, they're elusive, right? There's two kinds of credits that we break down in the module. Ones that you get through a regulated, sort of government-controlled market, like a cap and trade market, and ones that are just out there. It's called the voluntary market that anyone can access anytime, but you need a lot of land, and it takes a lot of initial investment and a lot of time. Those voluntary markets are always out there. There is no access to Nova Scotia woodland owners to a regulated market, which tend to be more preferable for people for carbon credits right now. But the federal government will be releasing, they say this year, a new protocol for improved forest management for woodlands which, fingers crossed, we'll know when it's released, should enable woodland owners, again with a lot of hurdles to get there though, but to potentially trade carbon credits from forests across the country. So that's, you can check the federal government's website, but there should be announcements this year on that front. But it's not just about carbon credits, there's other carbon opportunities and really this, emerging forest bioeconomy, whether it be, Minister Rushton talked about low-grade fiber, and, everyone in Nova Scotia that has some kind of involvement in the forest sector knows that issue of low-grade fiber. Well, there are new emerging opportunities, and there's been some studies commissioned by some consultant companies that have looked at this recently on what do we do with it. So there are opportunities for liquid fuels and plastics that are being investigated, as well as wood heat, of course, and even new updates to the building codes that are happening, like right now, to allow larger structures to be built out of wood, mass timbers that won't be using pulpwood, but they can use lower grade fiber for those as well. So there's lots of new things happening on the carbon front, above and beyond just carbon credits as well. And I'll end today with a little snapshot of forest carbon in Nova Scotia and where we are. So this is carbon storage in the in the trees that are alive, above and below ground across the province. And darker blue is more carbon. There's 212 million tons. Does anyone know what that means? No, it's a pretty meaningless number if you don't have context. So don't worry, 779 million tons of CO2. So there we go. But to give that meaningful context, that's how many megatons of CO2 the average person emits. Those are the carbon emissions from Canada's entire economy. So there's a lot of carbon in just the living parts of Nova Scotia's forests. And we can break that down by county here, a little small on this screen. Cumberland's looking pretty good there, in the pack, in the middle of the pack. Oh, wait, no, it's a bit further down. No, I was thinking that guy. Well, room for growth is great too. And you can pit your counties against each other if you want here, but maybe a more meaningful delineation of our carbon here is by ecoregion. And you can see how carbon differs across the landscape. A bit less in the highlands on the coast, as you might expect. A whole bunch up on the, if you drove over Cobequid Pass, you were up in pretty carbon-rich country, and we're not so bad here on the other side of the hills as well. But that's not the only carbon that the forest stores. There's the carbon that's stored in standing dead trees, down coarse woody material. That's about half the amount of carbon in the living forest. And there's 2 gigatons of carbon, very preliminary estimates, of course, but that are stored in the soil. So generally when you're out there in the forest, there's more carbon below your feet than above your head. And forest management can be done in a way, or should be done in a way, that tries to keep that carbon in the soil. Because small changes in that number can equate to a lot of carbon that goes to the atmosphere. And lastly, there's carbon stored in our products. As you can see here from the recent Registry of Buyers report, they're out every year. We do some research as well at the department, not just on carbon stocks and modeling, but also looking at life cycle assessment. So we did a recent study on life cycle assessments of forest bioenergy systems for combined heat and power. And trying to demystify or untangle that, because when it comes to forest biomass energy, there's a lot of energy in the conversation and in the debate. So this study just attempted to try and shed some numbers to it and try and open it up to folks. That's another study that we just released as well. Happy to share that. And with anyone, there is my email, and thanks very much. I went a bit long, but I think there's time for at least 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. Question, anyone?